Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out devx.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
And I'm joined by two DevX colleagues this week. I've got Anna Goel with me. Hey, Anna.
Hey, Raj.
Anna's, of course, our managing editor. And Alyssa Miolene is with us. Hi, Alyssa.
Hey, Raj. Hey, Anna.
And Alyssa covers all things global development right here in Washington, D.C. I think all three of us are in D.C. today. And it probably is appropriate because we've got a very D.C.-oriented show. We're going to be talking all about a number of stories that have really just published, and they all deal with U.S. foreign assistance policy, some of the micro and some of the macro. Maybe, Anna, I can just start with you. Tell us what we just published, because there's a lot of activity on DevX today.
Yeah, there really is. So one of the stories, I'll leave all of the USAID stories to Alyssa, but another really important one that just came out today is one by our colleague Michael Igo. It breaks down the changes that Republicans, specifically Donald Trump, would enact if they win office in November. And these changes really transform and really upend U.S. foreign aid policy. Michael talked to various Republican operatives like Max Primorak, who was the lead author of a chapter on USAID in what's become known as this transition playbook released by the Heritage Foundation. It's a document that's full of sweeping changes. Among other things, Republicans would axe kind of what Heritage calls Joe Biden's progressive priorities, like gender equality and climate change, which they say recipient countries don't even want. It would also really claw back a lot of spending, kind of right-size what Republicans say is right-sizing the foreign aid budget after years of emergency spending fueled by COVID, wars in Ukraine, Gaza, etc. And among other things, too, not to kind of go into too detailed of a list, but they would stack positions in USAID with political appointees. Some Republicans have floated the idea of rethinking how aid gets divvied up among agencies, shifting more resources away from USAID. Interestingly, one area, maybe the only area of convergence between Republicans and Democrats, is localization, which both sides support, but Republicans would be a lot more aggressive in confronting what they kind of call the aid industrial complex that Heritage says mostly benefits the progressive left. So that would be another kind of potential major change. And one last brief final note that I think is important to stress is that, you know, when Donald Trump came to power in 2016, and no one really knew what he would do policy-wise. I mean, maybe he wasn't sure himself, but a second administration would be a lot more prepared for policy. The Heritage document is about 900 pages long. It spells out policy proposals in great detail. Of course, there's no guarantee Trump will embrace these proposals, just like there's no guarantee he'll win in November. But I think the development establishment has to equally be prepared that this could be a new reality. And I do think that will make a whole lot of people pretty nervous.
Yeah, this is a big topic of conversation here in DC, in the hallways, in hushed corridors. People they want to know, what is this all going to mean? And I've spoken to my own Republican sources, and, there's a spectrum of views. On the one side, you get people who say, don't be so freaked out about a possible Republican administration because things will be like they were last time. A lot of things will be talked about, big changes from the White House, but in the end, Congress will not allow those changes to go forward. But I think as Michael's piece lays out, the presidency in the United States has a lot of power, and Donald Trump and a lot of his supporters have suggested they're going to use that and maybe really push the envelope. And so even if you get a Congress that continues to generally support in a bipartisan way the broader development project, there are lots of specific areas where a Trump administration could pretty radically change things. And, a couple of the big themes that are in the piece that I've had conversations with people about, a big one is multilateralism, right? Does the Trump administration really support the extent to which U.S. government is sending money to UN agencies to do things like humanitarian response. And it's in the piece, we have sources who say no. And I've heard the same. So, that's a big deal. If the administration can reduce that spending, can not send the money there. And I guess there is the potential, even when Congress appropriates, for the Trump White House to say, well, we're not going to spend the money, to slow it down. And we've seen some examples of that in the past, and I think there's real potential for that going forward. And then there's the issue kind of within and between the development agencies, which Michael also talks about in his piece, where maybe there will be a much bigger emphasis on the DFC and on the MCC, which are seen as both initiatives that were created during Republican administrations, and both initiatives that align a little bit better to some conservative principles like accountability and private sector engagement. And also, potentially, those would be agencies that are seen as more directly countering China and having kind of a foreign policy purpose. So you could see some pretty radical changes, but it's a debate, right? It's a debate in this town, something people are really talking about. And some people feel, a little bit more calm about it and say, don't get so freaked out. And others think this could be pretty existential for our development community here. Alyssa, you saw this story too, and I know you report on this beat. Any take from you on this story?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually the piece that jumped out to me the most in Michael's story is actually the very last paragraph, where, it kind of goes back to what Anna was saying before in terms of how prepared folks on the Trump side or the conservative side are this time around. He has a line here that says, in 2016, officials inside USAID prepared detailed transition binders to assist Trump's team, only for no one from that team to show up before Inauguration Day. And now, as Anna mentioned, there's this, multi-page, hundreds of pages of detailed plans and proposals. And that to me almost is kind of the biggest shift between this time and last time, and just kind of paints the picture of, it's a different rodeo now. And I think at the same time, aid, development, humanitarian crisis, they've just taken up, much more airtime, much more discussion time. And it's, this time around does feel a little bit different for whatever.
It's a great point. And the piece, also emphasizes another theme that I've been hearing a lot about. And one is, when Trump first came in 2016, America First was a very clear rallying cry for his administration. And so people could sort of guess what that might mean for foreign assistance. And we saw examples like, telling countries in Central America, if they don't change their policy to stop migration, the Trump administration is going to cut off aid, which they ultimately did. But this time around, it seems like there's a much more robust political lens on foreign assistance, which is essentially saying that U.S. foreign assistance under President Biden has been used to advance a woke agenda, quote unquote, and that woke agenda, shows up in things like gender equality. It shows up in things like abortion and in things like climate. And so there's a much more political angle now than I think there was. It's more fleshed out than it was in 2016. And that gives it legs to go beyond sort of an inside baseball conversation in the halls of USAID or the halls of Congress, right? And it gives a chance for candidates out there who are running for office to talk about foreign aid as a election issue. That's a different dynamic than I think we saw before. And that could lead to, more support, in particular from some of the more right-leaning kind of MAGA members of Congress, to really be pushing for this kind of an agenda, which would be a different dynamic than we saw in a first Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to chime in, it's interesting these political narratives that both sides are embracing. For instance, when Republicans say in terms of these progressive priorities, this woke agenda that recipient countries don't even want, they claim that actually pushes these countries into the arms of China, which doesn't have these kind of strings attached. But on the flip side, Democrats actually use the China argument as well. They say that when they kind of lump everything into promoting human rights, promoting democracy, promoting liberal Western values. And, they say if we abandon that in favor of only promoting like geostrategic allies, then these recipient countries China will step in and curry their favor. So it's interesting when you talk about this political dynamic, it's interesting, China factors highly into it, but both sides are kind of using it to advance their agenda.
It's a great point, and it's something actually that extends beyond the United States. It's really across the West. I think we have reports from London and Brussels from our colleagues who report on those aid politics in those markets, that China really is the one thing that seems to unite all parties. Kind of an anti-China bent seems to really work politically. But as you say, it might be enough to unite both parties around the idea that foreign assistance is needed. But after that, there's a lot of dispute about how to actually spend the funds and really what the level of funds ought to be. And that's a big part of this, is a question around, could we see dramatic cuts? So much of the increase in U.S. foreign assistance over the last 5 years or so has come because of conflict. It's come because of the war in Ukraine, now the Israel-Gaza conflict. And there's a question as to whether will we ever see big supplementals again, as we've seen almost $10 billion in humanitarian aid passed just about a month ago by the Congress. Will that happen again if the Trump team, would they come into office, if they're this against funding UN agencies to do humanitarian work? Could you really even get out big numbers of humanitarian aid, or maybe in the end it turns into large cuts? So it's possible that these reform questions themselves could help us lead to pretty significant cuts in the overall foreign aid budget, a budget that itself is already going down, even under the Biden administration, right? So the dynamics look a little bit challenging, and certainly one side of the argument that I talk to are people who are really worried that we could see maybe not a one-off, 30+% reduction in foreign aid as was proposed by Trump budgets in the first Trump term, but maybe just a continuing slide, 5%, 10%. And if that happens, we've already had a 5% cut last year. If that continues to happen over a few years, over several years, it would really have a significant shift for this field.
I do think that's a really interesting and important point, Raj, in terms of the humanitarian aspect of things too. I mean, if you kind of go through this chapter where the Heritage Foundation and the individual that Michael talks to, Max Primorak, writes, there is a real kind of concern with this quote unquote massive growth in emergency aid. And Max kind of points to these cases where this aid has been used, whether it be by a government like the Taliban or, kind of these warring actors that are not aligned with the U.S., right? And it does seem like that really is in the bullseye. And this is at a time when crisis is escalating, right, all across the world. So yeah, it certainly raises questions. It makes one think what will happen as these emergencies continue to rise across the globe.
Yeah, it's a tough argument to counter, when you say actually more humanitarian aid is a net negative, which is sort of what he's saying in a sense. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but essentially he's saying, look, a lot of this humanitarian aid is counterproductive. And look at the countries we've been funding with all this aid, and is the situation better there or worse? So, that's a tough argument to counter, but it does bleed into this broader question around reform. Not just how much we spend, but how we spend it. And that's a really fascinating concept, because there's a bit of bipartisan agreement on that, right? And I think you alluded to this earlier, Anna. There's a bit of bipartisan agreement that, yeah, actually we do need some reforms in the way we do things. There too, just like in the anti-China argument, at the surface level, there's agreement. Very quickly, you see a very different view on what should be done. But at a high level, there is a sense that, look, the way we do U.S. foreign assistance isn't really working right. It seems like both sides are pushing against the quote-unquote aid industrial complex, right? We had Samantha Power quoted in our pages. I think it was a panel that I moderated in Davos a couple of years ago where she talked about the aid industrial complex. And here you have Republican operatives talking about the aid industrial complex. There's a unified view that has to change, but yet the way you change it looks pretty different.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at DevEx, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of DevEx Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
I think that also brings us into some of our other news that we did break today in terms of how USAID is trying to change things, and in terms of there is on both sides, like you're saying, a push toward localization and toward funding more local organizations instead of kind of the same set of very, very large contractors and very large organizations. We did today get a bit of an update on that in terms of how USAID is going and how they have been going since that ambitious push was announced back in 2021.
Yeah, it's actually a big news day for USAID localization, right? We've had a few pieces out this morning. This story from you, Alyssa, that talks about the USAID numbers and what they really mean and unpacks them. Then we have an exclusive op-ed from the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, kind of interpreting those numbers and making the case for what's going right, what's going wrong, where she's trying to take the agency. And then we have a kind of a lobby group in town, Publish What You Fund, with their own take on the way things should go. All of those are out today, so people who care a lot about USAID localization, which I know a lot of people do, have quite a big news day to go through. Maybe you can just, Alyssa, give us a take, first of all, on what do the numbers say? What did your story find?
Definitely. So basically today, the agency released a report talking about last year. So that's 2023. And they actually found that 9.6% of the agency's eligible dollars went toward local groups last year. And that's down about a half percentage point from the year previous. In 2022, it was 10.2%. So this is a setback, right? And this is something that I think, we weren't quite expecting. I mean, I think in the lead up to reporting on this story, folks were kind of expecting perhaps like a small incremental increase. But no, we got a decrease. And though it's small, it still matters. You kind of look at this in terms of the larger ambition in the picture that Samantha Power put out a couple of years back, which was in 2021. She wanted 25% of the agency's eligible funds to go toward local organizations. Something that, for folks interested in this topic, eligible funds is kind of this pain point among some in terms of talking about, okay, well, what is the denominator? What pot of money are we looking at? And what pot of money should be shifted toward local organizations? So we could talk more about that later, but back to the major numbers. I mean, when you look at this year, 2023 compared to 2022, that was actually a $50 million cash decrease. So, that's a decline. Though Samantha Power in her op-ed and USAID is quick to also point out that it still marks the second highest level of local funding in over a decade, percentage-wise. So, there's a couple different things going on here, and there's, bits and pieces in terms of, okay, well, is this really the right way to be defining local? And is this really, the right pot of money that we should be looking at? But those are kind of the headline numbers. We've got 9.6% for 2023.
Anna, maybe you could just clue our readers into the opinion piece from Samantha Power. What is the case she's trying to make in that piece?
Yeah, I mean, she admits that where USAID is currently at is quote a far cry from the 25% goal. But then she really goes on to detail some of the ways that the agency is trying to address and dismantle the barriers that localizations have encountered for years, if not decades. The most prominent kind of piece of the puzzle is a website called workwithusa.gov, which, just like it sounds, work with USAID. It provides kind of a roadmap for local organizations to help them win awards. It's translated into French, Spanish, and Arabic, and translation is an area that they're keenly looking into. It's trying to cut red tape. US is trying to make its compliance requirements more reasonable. That's something she wrote about. Instead of preparing kind of these lengthy funding applications for an award that an organization may not even get, a USAID mission may initially ask for simple concept notes. And of course, she cites success stories. There's a mission in Morocco that she details where it's doing some really strong localization work. But on the whole, while it's good to hear of the success stories, it remains to be seen if these kind of stories can be replicated at all of the missions around the world that USAID has. So really that's what the op-ed is kind of detailing what the main attempts that they're doing to rectify the situation.
Yeah, I was interested in that anecdote that she starts her piece with, because I was actually in that same small town in Morocco about 2 or 3 weeks after she was there. And I think her emphasis on place, on specific countries and specific missions is important because, it's a very diverse set of places where USAID works. And there are going to be places, Morocco is a good example, that have a lot more local capacity and, are further up on the income scale and where it's going to be much easier to find local partners that meet USAID's requirements. And so there, it's maybe more a question of getting the mission oriented around this goal and pushing them toward finding opportunities to work with more locally led actors. Whereas there are going to be other contexts that are just much more challenging, where there isn't as much of a domestic ecosystem of local players. And so it's a diverse picture. But as Alyssa says, and as kind of Samantha Power tries to somewhat counter in her piece, the numbers are a little bit mixed, right? You see the overall number flat to down, and then you see Samantha Power saying, well, but look, there's some other green shoots here. Look at some of the places where we're seeing the numbers turn up, including the number of organizations that we're working with that increased by 25%. And the number of awards to these local partners, new awards, is up by 45%. So there are places where you see activity working, but it seems to be, by my reading of it, very country by country. You see like the success stories like Morocco that she logically leads the piece with, but then there've got to be exact examples on the opposite side of the ledger in order to get to this state where the overall number is flat to down.
Yeah, and I think, that brings us to a point, something that she made about the mission in Morocco, that it's not just about the, that 25% pledge that we often refer to, but there's a second part of that pledge, which is of Samantha Power's pledge, which is to have USAID initiatives be truly locally led, so that local actors are really their feedback and their expertise is incorporated throughout the program life cycle. That's something that, she touted is happening in Morocco. And, overall, the U.S. figures they created, this is an ambiguous target. How do you decide, how do you quantify that, that power is being, shifted to local organizations? And they did have come up with something called locally led programs indicator. There's been a pilot program, showed that the agency is progressing, though it admitted the bar on the pilot program may be too low. And I think what's interesting about that, and Alyssa, maybe you can pick it up, you wrote about this, is we kind of get back to measurements and metrics and the difficulties of defining this. You Alyssa talked about eligible funding. I mean, by some counts, only half of total USA spending is quote unquote eligible to go toward local organizations. And then of course there's the debate of how do we define local? Do local affiliates of big multinational organizations count? So needless to say, it's a really complex picture. And a lot of these metrics, while I think USA deserves some credit for putting itself out there and holding itself accountable by numbers, numbers can be malleable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And something that, this is a common kind of tension, right? Within, okay, well, what do we mean by local? And what do we mean by, is, for example, like a World Vision Uganda with a number of local staff and managers, does that count as local or does it not? And I think that's a real kind of question that people are going back and forth on. I mean, in terms of the Publish What You Fund story, that really digs into that further and says, okay, well, actually, if you go by this narrower definition of local, USAID's numbers in terms of how much they localized last year actually dropped to 5.2%, given their definition. So, that's half. So there's a lot of different things to consider here in terms of how we measure this, what it really means to be local, what money should really be put toward that. I think there's also a really interesting thread here with whether humanitarian aid can or should be localized. And you've got, back to our point earlier in the conversation, so many crises across the world, and a lot of that funding goes to United Nations programming, and a lot of that goes straight to those big entities instead of local orgs, which sometimes, as we learned in COVID, those local orgs could be the last ones there, the last ones standing. So lots of questions to answer. I do think, to Anna's point as well, USAID is one of the only big government agencies that's really trying to do this so publicly. Someone from Publish What You Fund did tell me that they've offered to, they've offered to run other governments' numbers and they're like, no, please don't, because we don't want to know, because then we're going to have to do something about it. So we're just going to watch what USAID does, right? And I think that's what a lot of not just local organizations, but governments are doing at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good point, Alyssa. And it just shows, I think it underlines just how tough all of this is. There's good arguments on the other side of what Publish What You Fund says, even though I do hear lots of people who basically agree with them, lots of, including the international NGOs, that they're calling out and saying, look, the local office of World Vision shouldn't count. Most of those international NGOs agree with Publish What You Fund. They don't want their local office to count. On the other hand, you've got to say, well, what's the goal? If the goal is to get more money into organizations that are more locally rooted, that are run by local people, a lot of these international NGOs are kind of set up to do that. And they do have teams that are largely or entirely local. So you sort of wonder, are we getting down the road of just checking boxes? And could you end up, as a result, undermining the broader development goals, right? Because clearly localization is just one step on the path to development. And similarly, Publish What You Fund in your piece calls out the case of Bangladesh, right? Where they say, look, there's Rohingya refugee crisis been going on for years there. And Bangladesh has some of the best, local organizations in the world. Think of BRAC, probably the world's largest NGO by employees, is Bangladesh based. And yet that money goes to UN agencies. Why is that? And why is that not counted? But I imagine that USAID has pretty good reasons for that, right? Some of them might be in terms of the relationship with the government and the ability for the UN to be more of a neutral actor than local players could be. And some of it could be USAID's own capacity, as you report in your piece on localization today, Alyssa. One of the big questions is, does USAID have enough staff to actually localize itself? Does it have the contracting officers? Something that the administrator has been working on, but has faced real uphill battle with Congress on getting the funding to empower more people to actually make these localization decisions. So it is a really tough conceptual issue here, and it's a tough logistical issue. And what I hear from some sources I talk to is, maybe this is just sort of the wrong target. That they're shooting their arrows at the wrong target. And somewhere in your story, you talk about the idea that USAID, as part of this, is pushing for more of a pay for performance approach, and that maybe that should have been the first thing to shoot for. Because if you do more pay for performance, you might logically and naturally end up funding lots more local organizations, because the argument is they're just much more cost effective. But instead, by having a check the box rubric, are they headquartered in this country? Do they have a local staff? Did we go on listening tours? All these sort of check boxes could lead to basically people gaming the system. And so it's a really important and interesting debate that people are talking about. And I know that today's numbers are going to just fuel that debate even further.
I think that there is a bit of optimism here, which is that, I talked to a couple of folks who really just said, okay, well, look at PEPFAR, right? Like, we have seen this work in the past in terms of PEPFAR in 2018, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief from the US government. They wanted a 70% mandate for localization, and they've really pushed for that. And if you look at the country by country localization targets, at least for USAID's measurement, all of the countries with the highest localization primarily are PEPFAR countries. And that's because they have this push toward localization and in terms of that kind of really working. So now, one of the folks that I mentioned that I spoke with in the piece, he said, there's nothing kind of magical about HIV that made this happen, but for whatever reason, they had the right number of kind of policies and procedures in place to push this forward. So while we can be confused and unsure, there are things that are working, right? And it'll be interesting to see as we go forward whether that will be carried and how far we can actually take an agency-wide approach to localization as opposed to just one bureau or one part of the puzzle.
It's a great point, Alyssa. And also another point of optimism is the fact that this is a bipartisan issue, at least at this point. And as we earlier, gave all the caveats around that, but it is bipartisan. You actually do have Republican members of Congress and Democratic ones who believe in this issue. And it's been something that multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat, have worked on for years, haven't made that much progress, given all the effort and all the time and all the rhetoric. But yet there has been this sustained longer term push. So if it survives this term of this administrator, whichever president is elected next, there's a chance that this will continue to move forward, and that maybe eventually we will see these numbers start to move in a more rapid direction, in the direction that a lot of people in the development community certainly want to see. And any final thoughts from you as we wrap up?
Yeah, so we had one more story that I kind of wanted to highlight, which is one by our UN correspondent, Colin Lynch. It's a really great explainer on how exactly the UN kind of how the leadership posts go to the people that they go to, how the regional rotation system works. And, it's what's to me really fascinating is kind of the UN. Like when you Google it, it says it's the world's only truly universal global organization. But when you look at like the top echelons, it's the 5 veto wielding members of the UN Security Council. It's American, it's British, it's French, it's Chinese, and it's Russian. They've got a lock on all of the top positions like humanitarian relief, political affairs, etc. And, even though Colin points out in his stories that these 5 countries only constitute 3% of UN membership. So Colin really details in this report that I really recommend is not just the top positions, but the whole hiring system is a bit messed up. It's largely, again, kind of mentioned this regional rotational system that divvies up jobs by region, not necessarily by merit. And this has really thwarted UN reforms for decades because you're excluding qualified candidates. But the reason it's thwarted it for decades is because people don't easily give up power. So it's not a situation that's going to change overnight, but it really is an insightful article into how the inner workings, I should say, of how UN positions get doled out.
Well, the other key thing to remember is that most of these UN agencies rely on voluntary contributions for a massive percentage of their total funding. And so the fear has been, well, if you don't select the national of a big donor country and you kind of blow up the system, that those big donor countries will no longer prioritize funding these agencies. And by the way, to go full circle back to our first story that we talked about, if you already have Republicans on the Hill and possibly a Trump presidency saying we should stop funding these UN agencies, pulling out Americans and our allies from running them might make the situation just that much worse. So, Guterres has been in this tough spot even before a lot of these politics have gotten worse. And that, points maybe to the story that Colin leads with, which is Martin Griffiths, who, is a well-respected humanitarian who was in the UN system, but he was not the name that I think it was the Cameron government, no, it might have been Boris Johnson's government, actually. Boris Johnson's government put forward for that role. He was not the name. And Guterres said, well, I'm going to somewhat put my finger in that government's eye by not picking their candidate, but I'm not going to go so far as to pick a Brit. And so he reached into the UN system and pulled out Martin Griffith, who I think at the time was running humanitarian operations in Yemen, and put him into that role. And that was kind of his way of, splitting the baby. And we may be getting into a situation where, as much as people want to see these jobs be picked on merit, the politics are actually even harder than they've been in the past.
And Martin Griffiths himself has said he was kind of proud that he wasn't the UK's chosen candidate. And, I think he put it succinctly that it's just too crucial of a job to be left to favoritism. But I think we're all aware that odds are another British national will probably fill his role.
Well, as you can all tell, this has been a very busy week here at DevX. Lots going on in the development community, as always, and many stories that really at the intersection of politics and foreign assistance, as there always are, but I think in particular, as we look at the European parliamentary elections that just happened, Macron calling for a snap election, the strength of the AfD in Germany, and of course, just 9 days away from the first, actually 7 days away from the first U.S. presidential debate, and people are starting to really focus in on what that might all mean. So stay tuned for lots more from us on DevX on all of these beats, from my colleagues Alyssa and Anna and me and many others here. We really appreciate you tuning in to This Week in Global Development, and subscribe to the DevX Newswire to get all this news and more. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a DevX Pro member by going to devx.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.